All right. So, what we're presenting to you today is kind of a compacted version of the larger presentation that we did for many hours during our report release event. And that was a compacted version of the 130 odd pages of data and commentary and conclusions and action directives. So, very excited to see, like Paul said, how we can take this to the national level and collaborate on and strategize together to be able to attain the housing goals that people are asking for. So this is Pipe Dreams and Picket Fences, direction from Denver's houseless people on housing needs and priorities in the context of today's public housing. Even the name there, Pipe Dreams and Picket Fences, came from a few quotes, some survey respondents who are houseless community members who said, are picket fences even an option? I'd love a real simple place, one bedroom, somewhere to put my stuff. But it seems like a pipe dream these days. So it was a combination of two different quotes that had that kind of feel to them. And we appreciated the fact that it harkened to a time before when there was housing policy that made it accessible for some and made it an option. And this kind of idea, this fake fantasy of the American dream with that white picket fence. And then how, the reality is a lot further from that. So next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, so the survey asked 24 questions, some of which have multiple parts. These are just some examples of the questions that the survey asked. Questions were about sort of like your desired housing, about people's experiences trying to access housing, about support services, about barriers, about vouchers, and about like government action and needed action. These are like the types of themes of questions that were in the survey. You can find the actual survey on our website or on REP's website. Like it'll get into all of the questions if you want to read all of the questions, but that's some of the themes of the questions that we asked. We go next slide.
So the way that we actually conducted this survey, we went out into the community, to shelters, to the streets, to temporary hotels, anywhere that we knew that people were living and didn't have housing. And a big thing that really helped to our success in this project was that we had funding for $15 Visa gift cards for each person. It allowed us to be able, in a 6-week time frame, gather 828 total surveys from houseless individuals, which was pretty amazing. And also word travels fast in the community, right? So people are letting people know that this is what we're doing, and we're coming out here and talking to folks. And a huge part of that success is that our outreach team was people in the community as well. So like we had folks who already have those connections and know where people go, and are able to kind of navigate spaces a lot better than somebody who's not used to that kind of environment, or coming from the outside. And then we also had opportunities for other input that went into this report. So on the right, you can see an example for a flyer that was for one of our 4 identity specific or our 3 identity specific community forums, the African American Descendants of American Slaves and Black Community Forum. And then there's the Spanish speaking community forum, and then there's the queer or LGBTQIA plus community forum that were specific for certain identities. We had in-depth one-on-one interviews to kind of elaborate on some of the questions that the survey covers. And then we had lots of different meetings with our community to bring back every time along the process, bring back what we had found. So in total, we got over 1,000 houseless people who gave direction in this report. Next slide. And then we had to analyze 828 surveys, and these were paper surveys. So that adds another element of difficulty, but it also meant that people could elaborate and answer questions in ways that we didn't necessarily foresee or predict. So the difficulty of analyzing them is something to take into consideration if this is a project that you want to take on. But that being said, a lot of that difficulty was owed to the high volume of surveys, also owed to it being on paper, also owed to how we chose to include things written in the margins in order to help with our interpretation of answers and things like that. So that slide kind of talks more all about those factors, and we would love to go into that more if anyone wants to do this survey, go into methodology.
Yeah, so we coupled all of this survey research with also public housing research. And these are the questions we were really trying to get at for the public housing research. Things about cost, rent increases and rent burden, fiscal trends, both nationally and locally. And that's some of the stuff that'll definitely be really relevant for all of the RAP members and everybody across the nation, because we looked at like what's being spent on a federal and national level around housing and housing for poor folks in particular. Units lost, looking at that both nationally and locally, and then the voucher system, which we'll talk much more in depth on. These were the types of questions we did research on together with a university, a DU class that helped do a lot of the data research, finding the actual information from the government sites and so on. And then also a research assistant who dug in deeper. We can go next slide. Oh, there's me. Oh, okay. So one of the big themes of this housing survey is about desired housing. We wanted to know, what housing do people actually want? When we talk about housing, what do you desire? Not just what you're forced into, but what do you desire? We also have some quotes that you'll see throughout this that we don't need to read all of them because that's a lot, but throughout our report and throughout this work, we did a lot of interviews, like we mentioned, and these quotes come from those or come from the community forums. And you can see pictures of what folks said there. We can go to the next slide. So, really the start of this question of desired housing is a basic question of, do you want housing? We asked that question a variety of different ways throughout the survey. And so it was helpful to look at it from different ways. And overwhelmingly, what rose very clear is that folks want housing. So a couple of ways that we asked this question. One of the ways, the one you'll see on the green one, I'll just refer to the color, whichever side it is on for you, is a question that we asked about if you were offered housing you could afford according to your income, would you move in? And you see to that, 82% of people say yes, 10% are unsure, and 7% said no. And I can say more of this later too, in terms of that unsure and like what that actually means. But bottom line here, you see an overwhelming yes with some uncertainty that we'll dig into. Also, we asked another question about have you been offered housing or a housing voucher and refused it? And you see there that 92% of people said no, 7% of people said yes. But it's important to dig into this uncertainty and this yes, I did refuse it. Like, okay, so what does that actually mean? So the next slide kind of digs into this a little more. So when we asked that, then we said, why? Okay, so you refused housing or a housing voucher. Why? Well, when we dig into that, what we actually found is this 7% bleeds down much smaller, because 17 of those people clarified in the notes, no, I actually didn't refuse it. So that boils down to then 40 people as opposed to 57. And then, other answers that we get here have things to do with like, they found other housing, or there was extraneous circumstances, like you had a medical health crisis that came up, or lost paperwork or things like that. Didn't finish process. A number of people, 7 people, did talk about not trusting the process, or a lack of hope and faith in the process. So anyway, these are the types of answers, that folks gave when they clarified more why, which are similar answers to what we see in a lot of what people are talking about when they say they're unsure. People said they wanted to know the details, give me the details, or I won't forfeit my rights. So those were the, types of things that people were saying when we're talking about, that kind of like, do you want housing or not? Yes, but I need it in that way, and I don't want to forfeit my rights, or it needs to be in a good location, and so on. So we can go to the next slide.
So again, in reference to that question, when you talk about wanting housing, what are you thinking of? That's again the question that our title came from, the Pipe Dreams and Picket Fences. It was the very first question on the survey, and one purposefully open-ended to understand when people think about that, what comes to mind. And we found that a top theme for this question was personal qualities. And that's actually a theme that was withheld throughout the entire survey in a lot of the top answer categories. And basically, personal qualities meant, as defined here, the human aspects of housing: safety, autonomy, community, privacy, things like that. And those were more important and more mentioned than physical attributes, than it was a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom. People will really associated housing with, familial aspects here. And also, it's important to see here that there were only 8 people who didn't want housing, and 20 people who wanted alternative housing, which would look like, they said they wanted an RV, or a specific tiny home that they built themselves, or something like that, that were different forms of housing, instead of not wanting housing. And again, like with this recurrent theme, it also came up in other questions, like I said. So this question here was about people's preferences for different past living situations. And we offered, housing that you owned, housing that you rented on a lease, housing that you rented without a lease, housing that was subsidized, service programs like mandatory service programs, supportive housing type structure, and then family and friends, living with family and friends. And so here you can see, personal qualities is that like red wine color for the wine lover. And it comes up as the top reason for all of them except for subsidized housing. And subsidized housing, why would you want that? Literally because it's cheaper. Money was the top reason there. And then family and friends, why would you want that? A sense of community. So other than that, security, privacy, things like that were incredibly important. And we saw it throughout. So next, affordability was about, and here's a quote from one of our specific forums. What about if all the housing was just affordable for everyone, no matter who you are? But affordability, became a top theme, obviously, in people's decision on housing and the kind they wanted. So get into that.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this again under barriers, but affordability was the top #1 barrier that people listed for housing. So very clearly what we found is that the reason people can access housing, the #1 reason was related to it being too expensive. So related to that, expensiveness of housing, we asked folks, what price would housing need to be for you to afford it? And people shared their own answers, whatever they felt they could afford based on their current income. So, not like an aspirational, but just based on your current income. And so you can see there, that's the answers. The highest number of folks needed it to be between 0 and 200. But just under that is between 200 and 400, and then, going down from there. And so I think, key things to really take away from this is that only 17% of people needed the housing to be completely free, but there is 17%, that needed that. And 88% of people needed the housing to be under $1,000 a month. So some people said that they could afford things that are above that, but that's a very small percent. And so when you match this up with what the price of housing actually is, they don't correspond. In Denver, and I know that this is much like in all of your cities, the average rent is not $300 a month. That's a very, very, very rare housing option. Average rent in Denver right now is roughly $1,900 a month. I know everybody's is a very high in cost of living and so on. So really like the big takeaway here is like, if we are going to talk about housing as a solution or housing for all or any sort of like plan to address houselessness, if that plan does not involve creating housing that is actually affordable at the price ranges that people can afford, we see right here, then that's not a solution. That's not a plan that's going to work. So we also talked about a lot of things related to the process for accessing housing. I thought this quote is a really powerful one where he says, this process is, talk to a case manager and they fill out paperwork with you and they say, we'll get back to you. And they end up quitting, moving, and you have to start all over. You end up dying before you ever get in. And that type of sentiment around just the role of the case manager as a gatekeeper and just the continual process of waiting is really reflects what we found a lot in this survey. We can go to the next slide.
Right. So when we ask people, what's the process you need to go through to get into housing? These are how their responses played out. We're going to talk about kind of just the top ones for sake of time, the top 4 especially. So program, you need to go through an organization. People as individuals cannot access housing by themselves. They need to have a representative to do so. And what does that representative look like? That's a support in the form of a case manager, counselor, some kind of housing expert, just to be able to explain the process because of all the bureaucracy and paperwork and things like that. And financial support is the third step. People said literally you gotta have money and recognize that as a top way to get the housing that they needed. The fourth one there was, qualifying for housing. So qualifying for housing is a very contentious thing because right now, you have this narrative nationally that certain demographic groups are going to be able to be eligible for housing as opposed to others. And while they suggest that this is because they're looking out for certain groups or whatever it is, it's another way to divide people. It's another way to divide resources when you just don't have enough resources, and make it so that you're not saying that somebody can't get it because it doesn't exist. You're saying they can't get it because they don't qualify. And this was very evident in a lot of the feedback that we got. On the right, what was important to us to include in the report was an email from a city staff member when Therese was advocating on behalf of somebody who was living on the couches of a friend because they did not meet the definition of literal homelessness because they were living on someone's couch. It was suggested that once they become homeless again, and they're back on the streets, that's a good time for this person to reapply, because then all of a sudden they're going to qualify, at least on that level. So it was great to have a way through this report to really highlight this issue very tangibly, and show why it's not supporting people. It's dividing them also in a social setting. Our members, we see it in the greater community. We see it sometimes happen internally and have to address it. This idea that, why does that group get the housing that I need? Why are they getting it first? Why can I not get it? Why is it a different funding stream that I can't access that housing? And I've been houseless longer, or I'm facing more barriers, whatever the fuck it is. And the groups that they make are not based on, someone's vulnerability as they suggest, but again, it's based on a lot of other factors that just end up pitting people against each other for very limited resources.
Yeah. And so then, in addition to all of these qualify barriers, we asked folks a basic question of what barriers have you experienced in getting housing. As you can see here, by far the top reason, like multiple times higher than any other one, was not having money. Basically, the housing being unaffordable or not having the money to pay the rents that are currently being charged. So yeah, so again, fundamental here, if we're talking about housing for all, if we're talking about any solution for houselessness, and we're not addressing that, then we're not actually addressing the problem. The second one is interesting, is also kind of money related, is bad credit score. That was the second highest barrier that people named. And so, yeah, so addressing the fact that renters are pulling credit scores and discriminating against people or leaving people out of housing options because of bad credit, super critical. There's a number of these that have to do with things that are like sort of resource issues of not having phones or not having internet, stuff like that. And then also, of course, things like having a felony, a very big barrier for folks, and getting turned away from housing options, among many of these others. You can go to the next slide.
So we also asked about supportive housing programs in this survey that we did. The way that we defined or chose to define supportive housing program was a nonprofit that subsidizes rent so that the residents have to pay a third of their income or less for rent. And it usually involves like a lot of other aspects. It's not you get to live here, no worries, don't do anything, but it's also like you got to show up for these different things. Sometimes you have to do sobriety programs, you have to show up to classes, have to meet with a case manager frequently, things like that. So they can offer resources. It's very wide in the range within which they do and what they offer and how much of and what they expect. But we brought this to people and asked some questions about that as well. And this next slide, one of those questions was, if you've lived in a homeless or supportive housing program that's not a shelter, how would you describe your experience there? And first of all, we had, just over a third of our respondents say that they have lived in an environment like this. And we had mostly negative responses. People described all the different things that you could see there listed on the left. Something that was really tragic, when we asked them, okay, well, what kind of supportive housing program did you live in? 3 people specifically named prisons as a form of supportive housing program. And if you get to that point where you're naming prison as a supportive housing program, I think that's pretty tragic. So again, and to the last point, it's just important because this survey allows us a way to quantify what we already know, sentiments that we understand and experience, by just communicating and organizing around these issues. So
I just want to add the shelter point to that almost 30% of people talked about shelters unprompted, even though we actually said not shelters. Still 30% of people talked about shelters and talked a lot about the issues with shelters.
Yeah, and then we asked questions about like the rules that are imposed on housing that is meant specifically for houseless people, and the kind of supports and resources that are offered. So we asked people, what house rules would be deal breakers in order for you to accept that housing. And something that was really prominent that came up in a few different ways was no limits, having any kind of limitation on guests or visitors or roommates or partners. People rated that really highly, not just for this question, but other places in the survey. And so, this was a way to show that in order to make housing actually fit people's needs, you can't isolate someone. You can't take someone off the streets and say that when it's fucking freezing out, because it gets really cold here in Denver, they can't have, their mom stay with them in their housing so that, she can get out of the cold, or their brother, or, people that they've like know and love. Like, you don't have those kind of barriers to anyone who's going through the mainstream housing process that doesn't that completely excludes houseless people, right? So that's a huge thing. Curfew was another huge thing, and you can see the full breakdown there. And then, in terms of supports, we said, what does that look like in order for you to stay in the housing? Above all, once again, as we've said in so many different, ways, financial support. People just need to make sure that it remains affordable while they're there. And then this was another place where guests being allowed, which is not a traditional thing that you would think of as a support, was second ranked highest for what people need in order to be able to stay in that space. Afterwards, you have, of course, paperwork and bureaucracy, but you have constantly these arguments that legal support and mental health are first and foremost, and they definitely are supports that people said that they would like to have to stay in that housing. However, first and foremost, people need to be able to afford it and make sure that people that they love can visit and stay with them.
So we're going to shift a little bit to talking about kind of more of the research, the public housing research and the fiscal trends. I'm going to pass it over to Paul to really cover this section. And then we'll talk about the public housing specifically. But Paul has a beautiful quote here. We liked this quote. Paul doesn't like that we put his name as a quote here, but anyway, pass it over to Paul to talk about this.
This is where I think it really connects to the sweeps campaigns, because not only do we have the experiences and the voices and the reality of what people are saying based on the documented street outreach that is really important in any accountable community organizing campaigns, but we also have the fiscal realities to match and validate the experiences people are having. So we're not just telling people stories about how they're getting fucked over. We're doing the research to document how we could be doing shit differently, because we're 40 years into addressing contemporary homelessness in the United States, and the shit's worse than ever. And so this trend towards neoliberal fucking economic and social policies is really killing people. And you can see in these next couple of slides that, like, as we see with public-private partnerships, as we see with business improvement districts, as we see with privatizing our school system, as we see with our healthcare system and our prison system and our military, like, it's all about funding initiatives that create profits for corporate and wealthy individuals through tax credits, tax write-offs, or direct contracts into urban alchemy and other fucking groups like that. So, like, we have to be able to match the experiences and the stories of people with, like, all right, so this is how it's playing out on a systemic level if we want to get past just the storytelling mentality, or the organizations creating the solutions that other people need and other people want. And I think when you look at Housing First and you look at supportive housing, like, Corporation for Supportive Housing brags about the fact that they've created an industry of supportive housing. But when you look at what people are saying the kind of support they want in their home. So it's not a supportive housing program, but it's a home that they live in. They're drastically different priorities, drastically. And so the service resistant argument that is so attached to the justification for doing sweeps it gets called as bullshit when you look at these actual funding trends. Can you go to the next one? Like we see that the overwhelmingly largest housing program in the United States is the low-income housing tax credit program. It was initiated specifically, and you can see it in the 2010 RAP report, you can see it in this shit. Like, it was specifically created to incentivize profits for investors in order to fund housing for the poorest people in our communities. That makes no sense. Like, why aren't public parks just funded as good for everyone? Why isn't affordable housing funded as something that everybody needs? The welfare reform from the 1990s, like, literally changed the preamble to what public housing's role is, from one of ensuring that everybody has a decent place to live, and to not holding the federal government accountable that even a majority of people have a decent place to live that are poor. And this is where they're able to say, we have housing first, we have low-income housing tax credits, we have vouchers, all of which are profit incentivized funding streams, and none of which address the issues of our community members that are poor. So you see a lot of 80 to 120%. You see a small number of units that are actually affordable to people of low income. Like, and that's where the other thing is, like, then they become low income, very low income, extremely low income, fucking ass broke. Like, we start categorizing, like, people that were hungry are now food challenged. Families that were homeless are now poorly housed when they're doubled up and tripled up. Like, we create these categories in order to justify these programs of other people's realities, as opposed to looking at the human being and then saying, how can we address the issues that these people are facing as a community? We look at it as, how can we get them to fit into our little boxes? And how can we make goddamn sure that what we're doing, some motherfuckers, the 2010 RAP report has a chart that we got from the people that sell low-income housing tax credits on the open market. And it is the most convoluted, everybody's making a little coin during the process, 15-step process of how the tax credit becomes funding for affordable housing, and all of the entities that are making a profit off of that process before it gets from square A to square Z. And so when we're combating the argument about, we have all of this affordable housing, we need to be able, as organizers and as people that are pushing for systemic change to address neoliberalism, we need to be able to zero in on, no, you're really not. When you're talking 80% of area median income, you know, we need to educate ourselves in what is the area median income, and what does that mean, and what is the impact it's having on people, which is what this report, I think, does a really good job of. And you can see the numbers here, and you can see that it is the tool that they're using to drive the preamble and the pretense that they're funding affordable housing programs. And you can see that it has nothing to do with the reality of addressing unhoused community members in our communities. Can you go to the next slide? You know, and this is where the shit hits the road as far as I'm concerned, because we call this program, the tax write-offs for home ownership, we call this economic stimulus. When we talk about subsidizing housing for poor people, we call it charity. And that is, I think, the crux, the major fucking crux of why we see so many people living unhoused. Because if you're paying subsidy, or if you're paying mortgage and property taxes to as a homeowner, then it's economic stimulus, because the banks, the mortgage companies, the realtors, the construction companies are making money off of your shit. And therefore, that's economic stimulus. If you're poor and you're paying rent to a nonprofit, whatever, like you're paying the Section 8 project based, which hardly exists anymore, where it was for-profit entities that were doing Section 8 housing, it was somehow put under the category of that's charity, this other one is economic stimulus, so you're not worthy, you have to be screened, you have to be eligible, and fuck you. And I think that the more we can incorporate this knowledge base and this data and this reality into our organizing around how to address the fact that so much homelessness exists, and how to address the fact that racism and classism is really the crux of why so much homelessness exists, the more we can actually build our organizing base and build our Stop the Sweeps campaigns and build our push for creating housing opportunities where people are getting a home, not a program. I mean, I think it's really clear from people's responses to the questions that they were asked, they're looking for a home to live in. They're not looking for a fucking case manager to rehabilitate them to fit back into society and tell them they can't, that they're living under rules governed by their behavior. And having family members is something we allow you to do or we don't allow you to do. That's not a home. There ain't no motherfucker that goes to these people that are getting this housing subsidy program, which is $200 billion, and telling them who can come into their homes and who can't come into their homes, what time they have to be home, who can hang out with them, who can sleep on their couch. Not one fucking entity tells a homeowner who can come into their home because they get a housing subsidy through the IRS. But when it's poor people, all of that is dictated and the intakes are case managed, and it's fucking bullshit. And it's being able to get the information to call that out that is so relevant to the sweeps campaigns that we're all fighting. Next slide. Sorry, I'm going long. I'll shut the fuck up, I promise. You know, I mean, this is just a matter of, like, there was a long time in the first reports where we saw these massive decreases. I think they've now sort of leveled it out because we're including other programs into the HUD budget around homelessness, which it's so asinine to me that HUD funds homeless programs since they created the shit to begin with. But you know, we are not doing anything when you think of all the years that they've been talking about housing first. When you think of all of the local initiatives around community land trust and statewide land trust and statewide funding streams for supportive housing and funding supportive housing through, you know, CSH and VOA and all those motherfuckers, like, that is actual creating homes for people. And so when you hear service resistant, it's not people are service resistant to having a home as an alternative to sleeping in the goddamn streets. It's people are resistant to the rules and regulations and the intake process and the eligibility criteria and the trust that going through all that shit is actually going to have a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in order to get a place to live. And I think it's time for us to get really righteous about the fact that people want a home to end their homelessness. They're not asking for being rehabilitated with a behavior modification case manager, of which I was one for years, in order to address the fact that they're living in the streets. And I think that this kind of information, and we get the outreach in other communities if we want to do that, we can build off of this to couple the research that goes back to 83 when you look at without housing and what's been added to it with hand now, and the experiences of the individuals that we're talking about into a really powerful organizing tool, and get our artists to bring some artwork to it and shit. Like, I think there's some real powerful shit here that we can pull together. Next slide. And I always call this the obligatory, how do you say that shit? Obligatory, comparing where our funding priorities clearly lie, and comparing what it is that the needs of our community have. But you know, the Department of Defense budget outlays are totally corporate driven in terms of where that money is fucking overwhelmingly going. And when you look at, when we say we can't afford, and right now, folks, like, we are looking with this, not just with the debt ceiling stuff, which is calling for massive cuts to the HUD budget. We're hearing a lot about the food stamps budget and other shit, but they're also calling for massive cuts to HUD. Like, we also can see the writing on the wall, the COVID funding for emergency short-term hotels and shit, like, that shit's over. That shit's all closing down. Han did a great thing with a loft, and other cities are fighting the closures in their community. Like, that shit's gone. And we need to get, and the eviction moratoriums are gone. Like, that shit is over. And we are back to, we've spent all this money, now we need to make some fucking massive cuts. And I think history is a really clear teacher here. The cuts aren't going to be in the Department of Defense. They're going to be in the healthcare and the welfare and the housing programs that serve poor people. And we need to incorporate this into the sweeps campaigns and the fights that we're having at the federal level. And we need to get the national organizations that are claiming to rep the needs of and the priorities of poor and unhoused community members to be reflecting the shit that poor and unhoused community members are saying. And I will shut up and kick it back to Teresa and B.
All right, so yeah, to build on that, and also be aware of time, I will be much more brief than Paul. I will just cover these really quickly. So to build on that, the research we did on public housing shows exactly what we see here in these fiscal trends, which is a loss of public housing units. You can see on the next slide. Next slide. This shows that we are losing public housing units, not gaining them, which is reflected in what we saw already. And so these are units that are actually, owned by housing authorities, kept affordable, that are put with public dollars. And yeah, we've lost over 228,000 in the last 10 years. And when you add that together with the the units that were lost in the previous 25 years, we have almost lost 500,000 units of public housing. That, of course, does not look like a housing first model. That doesn't look like a pathway to getting folks who need housing in housing. This is the Denver numbers. You could see there's a loss also just locally in Denver. It's, you know, a pretty more recent loss it's interesting, you know, of a 731 units. But again, we have a loss, not a gain. You know, we're looking at, you know, here just locally in this one city, only having a total of just over 3,000 public housing units. For, you know, obviously many thousand more at that income level. Go to the next slide. So yeah, housing vouchers. This is a huge point. I think I'm talking about this too, aren't I? Yes. We can go on to the next slide. So you'll hear, as we saw in the fiscal trends that Paul already talked about, when you saw the graph that was showing the dollars that were increasing for vouchers and decreasing for public housing. Well, that's exactly what we see in reflection of units and of vouchers that are being brought forward. Nationally, I'm sure you all heard, you know, vouchers for all campaigns and this massive push, and you probably like experienced it locally where like, you know, out of 10 houseless folks, you know, that got housing, probably the majority of those people got it through a voucher. Because it's more and more and more the, you know, solution to houselessness, the path that our nation is going down in terms of how we're going to get folks in housing. But what we see in the reality is that does not play out that way. So something that you'll see here is, you know, that there's a net gain of vouchers funded. So that they say that, you know, there's over 350,000 vouchers being funded. But then when you compare that to the people housed with a voucher, there's a decrease of people housed with a voucher, over 130,000. So, you know, how does that match up? It gets very confusing. You're like, wait, we have all of this more money going towards vouchers, and we all of this have these additional, you know, funded vouchers, and then we have a decrease of people housed with those vouchers. How does that all add up? Well, there's a lot to this, and you know, we don't have time to talk about everything, but you know, I think it's really important to note that like the dollars that are going to a voucher are directly tied to the cost of housing in the market. So like if your market is going up, you know, right now our average you know, price for one bedroom is $1,900. That means that the price of the vouchers have to keep going up. And this has a cyclical relationship with that it's driving market prices. You know, to the extent to where, for example, in a local county here in Colorado, they told somebody we were working with that 90% of their voucher dollars go to keep people in the housing with those vouchers, not to new people getting vouchers. You know, we don't have time to get into all of the details of this. It was very, very hard to get data on this. We had to really fight to get any information, and the little information we did. Yeah, so anyway, I'll pass it over to B now. Yeah.
So I think we actually skipped a slide. So if we could go back one slide. Yeah, so these infographics were so powerful and so impressionable during the report presentation. They really do stand alone, but I'll offer a little bit of insight. Here you can see just under 20,000 people applying for the lottery, for the chance to receive a housing voucher. And that is only going to result in a 6% chance of their name being selected. If you want to go to the next slide. So from that 1,000, that 6% of people who were so lucky to get the chance to have their name pulled, all of a sudden there's still a process. So, you know, that process involves having a way for the, this is from the Denver Housing Authority, to be able to actually reach out to people and get in touch with them. and be able to get them to complete an application. So they had to have a physical mailing address. They had to have contact information that was current, and not have any changes since they had applied. And they had to have a way, basically, to submit back that information, to mail back a packet with all of their, official documents. They had to get birth certificate copies, everything, all within a very timely fashion in order to meet deadlines, so that they weren't, excluded. The next step was, well, if you want to go back, actually, there's a few more steps. So from that 1,000, you have only 344 who were successful with that and have their applications processed. But now you have the next step of how do they actually get their voucher after the application was processed. And that's suggesting, like, first of all, were they then approved because nothing has changed in their definition of homelessness? They're not living on someone's couch and now all of a sudden disqualifying themselves by revealing that information, or whatever else it is. And then it has to also be people who show up physically in person to receive the physical document for orientation about the voucher and to meet with their special processing people. Then they go out into the community. And they're like, okay, now I have this voucher. And what it really does is it says, hey, like, I have my rent subsidized, I pay a portion of it, but most of it is paid by, this funding. And they have to go find landlords to accept it. And we face all kinds of, situations where individuals tell us that they're being discriminated against and not able to use their vouchers. Things as simple as having the agency, that gave them the voucher. In some cases, it's a different agency, like Mental Health Center of Denver. Now, all of a sudden, you have another layer to discrimination where a landlord reads, oh, wow, mental health center, and might choose to deny then and there. Simply knowing someone is coming off the streets or, just doesn't have housing is enough of a deterrent for a lot of landlords to find other ways, even though legally they're supposed to accept it. So what does that mean? That means 77 people of the 1,000 actually were successful in attaining housing with those vouchers. Well, actually not just with the vouchers, but after getting their name pulled. So that's an 8% chance of being able to find your housing if your name was pulled for the lottery. And next slide. You can see what a huge pool of people are left without any options through this voucher process. So when you have so many people accessing the system, you have nearly 20,000 people accessing. By the time this data was collected, and some of the numbers they said on that last slide, they changed, but the graphs themselves reflect that by the time that these vouchers expire, which is a 120-day period, and it was only different for this, for some of the numbers because they went up because of COVID. So COVID allowed for extensions for this. But now, if we go back to the 120 days, within those 120 days, you only have 77 people. You have a 0.4% chance of attaining housing with the glorified vouchers that have been used as the primary pathway to housing these days. So yeah, very awful information.
So action is needed. And we asked the last survey, or last question in our housing survey was about what action is needed. And go to the next slide. What do you think the government could do better with housing to address homelessness was the basic question. We got 987 proposed action items. People had proposed actions, lots and lots of ideas, and lots and lots of ideas very specific to housing. What you see here is overwhelmingly the top type of answer was some answer related to make housing, give people housing, make it affordable, various like general kinds of like create more attainable, affordable housing answers. And then, just under that, we have answers that are a lot more focused on like make housing that's specifically for houseless people, that's like for houseless people, not just for anybody, that's not just for the rich, or for folks who are disabled, and then make housing for everybody. Then there was another big category of answers related to the process that had to do with like addressing issues with the housing process, with discrimination, and much more. So really a lot of very insightful answers to what government action should be. And overwhelmingly, what we heard from the community is that the action needs to be taken and that there is a responsibility on the government to take action to make housing that we can actually afford. We can go to the next slide. So from everything that we found in the survey, in the interviews, in the public housing research, we put all of that together, looked at it all, and tried to draw out, okay, what does this mean in terms of action directives? What are we hearing here about what we as a community need to be fighting for the housing that we need? And so we drew out of that 35 action directives, which is a lot. Right here, we see 10 of them listed, and we can't even get into all 10 of these. But there's just a lot of really the critical basic actions addressing the ways that case managers are used as gatekeepers, addressing the barriers to housing in terms of criminal backgrounds and credits, and big end all be all is fighting for public housing that's not a commodity, that is built at the scale of the need, that is kept affordable, and that's not a part of this market system through the vouchers and through the LIHTC, that is really not leading to the sort of low income housing that our community needs. So those are some of the directives that we drew out of it. A lot more could be drawn out, but it's really exciting to be able to now be at a place to say, okay, let's put this to action. And it's kind of the process we're in right now with our members in hand, as we're working through what is our next steps here now, in terms of like putting all this into action. So next slide. And yeah, so with that, we'll talk about that with all of y'all, because that is like the most exciting part, is how we can work on a national level on this shit, and not just us here in Denver.